Bonjour, bienvenue à la conférence de presse. Good morning, welcome to this media availability. I'll give it to you, Minister McKenna, to start us off.
Well, thanks very much. Really happy to be here today. I want to recognize that I'm on the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. It's great to be here at the National Press Theatre. Unfortunately, we can't be together, but I'm joined virtually by an amazing colleague, the Honourable Maryam Monsef, Minister of Women and Gender Equality and Rural Economic Development, who plays a very important role in advocating for rural communities, remote communities, as well as small towns, as well as two other amazing women and experts when it comes to public transit in rural areas. We have Kelly Taylor from Rural Rides New Brunswick. Thanks for joining us, Kelly, as well as Jana Burns from Ride Well in Wellington, Ontario. COVID-19 has certainly reshaped so many aspects of our lives, including how we get around in our communities and how we connect with each other. As a government, our focus has never wavered from the health and safety of Canadians and on getting safely through this pandemic. But we will get through it, but we will still have the climate crisis to deal with. And as we make investments that are critical to restarting our economy and creating 1 million jobs, we need to look at ways to build back better, to building the Canada we want, with good jobs, a sustainable economy, cleaner air, and more inclusive communities where people want to live, work, and raise their families. We've been very focused on how do we support communities from coast to coast to coast. Just last week, the Finance Minister and myself announced that we doubled support to cities and towns and Indigenous communities by providing $2.2 billion for infrastructure. That will mean more money in communities to support public transit, broadband, community culture and recreation centers, getting Canadians to work in these communities, and restarting our economy. Last month, I announced with the Prime Minister nearly $15 billion in new funding for public transit infrastructure projects over the next 8 years, as well as Canada's first ever $3 billion per year permanent public transit fund. We're already committed to investing in public transit, and that's what we're doing. So this is building on what has already worked, the $28.5 billion that we're investing in public transit projects through our government. As part of that funding, we announced $2.75 billion in investments in zero-emission buses, also leveraging the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which will be investing $1.5 billion as part of its $5 billion commitment to public transit. We announced $400 million for active transit solutions, which is Canada's first ever active transit fund, which will fund cycling and walking paths across the country. Des investissements dans le transport en commun montrent comment nous voyons grand au Canada, en créant des emplois et en favorisant la croissance propre, en luttant contre les changements climatiques et en faisant de nos collectivités de meilleurs milieux de vie. Infrastructure is critically important. It's really about building the future that we need and the future we want. When we look at transportation, it is critically important to support our communities and to support people in those communities. And that's especially true for people living in rural, remote parts of Canada. And that's why we're here today. Canadians living in rural, remote communities and small towns, as well as Indigenous communities across the country, face unique challenges in accessing transportation options to help them get to work and school, access shops and services, and just get around. We've heard loud and clear from rural, remote, and small communities that they need specific funding to support their unique transportation needs. They need flexible solutions tailored to their community needs, their economies, and their geography. From on-demand busing services to volunteer community carpooling, rural Canadians have been finding unique ways to get around. That's why we're investing $250 million in our first ever Rural Transit Fund. We'll be working with communities to help them find the best transit solutions and provide them with support to make them a reality for more people. This is in addition to existing funding that's supporting transit projects in smaller communities like bus service in Selkirk, Manitoba, to a handy van in Fort Frances, Ontario. This will support job creation and economic growth in these communities. It'll help tackle the climate crisis, and it will help build more inclusive communities across the country. Les Canadiens qui vivent dans les collectivités rurales, éloignées et autochtones font face à des défis uniques en ce qui concerne l'accès à des options de transport, leur permettant de se rendre au travail et à l'école et d'avoir accès aux magasins et aux services. Ils ont besoin de solutions souples, adaptées à leurs besoins, à leur économie et à leur géographie. Qu'il s'agisse de services d'autobus à la demande ou de covoiturage communautaire bénévole, les Canadiens des régions rurales ont trouvé des moyens uniques de se déplacer. C'est pourquoi nous investissons 250 millions de dollars dans le tout premier fonds pour le transport en rural. Nous travaillerons avec des collectivités pour trouver les meilleures solutions de transport en commun et nous fournirons le soutien nécessaire pour qu'elles deviennent une réalité pour un plus grand nombre de personnes. Cela favorisera la création d'emplois et la croissance économique, contribuera à la lutte contre la crise climatique et permettra de bâtir des collectivités plus inclusives dans tout le pays. This funding is about creating equity amongst communities across the country and making sure that vulnerable citizens, often the elderly, those living with a disability, and low-income Canadians have the means to get where they need to go, no matter where they live. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. Il n'existe pas de solution universelle. Canada's first flexible, dedicated rural transit fund will support innovative and creative projects that help address the needs and gaps in these communities. Building big things in Canada has always been about nation building. We built big because we thought big. Now in 2021, it's time to think big and build again. Canada's first dedicated fund for rural transit solutions can help us create jobs right now, as well as growth, tackle climate change and build more resilient communities, and make communities more inclusive for all. 2021 est une année de changement et à Infrastructure Canada, nous continuons à chercher des moyens novateurs de mieux faire les choses. As I've said before, every taxpayer dollar that we invest must do triple duty. It needs to create jobs at a time when we need it, as well as economic growth. It needs to tackle climate change and make communities more resilient. And we need to create communities that are more equitable so that every Canadian has a chance to succeed. And with that, I'd like to hand the virtual mic over to my colleague, Minister Monsef.
Well, thank you so much, Minister McKenna, for hearing the call of rural Canadians and rural leaders and for advocating so strongly for the first ever Rural Transit Fund. And I'd also like to thank the Prime Minister for recognizing that our country as a whole is stronger when rural communities are part of our prosperity. Bonjour, Anin, salam alaikum. I join you from my basement in Peterborough, Kawartha, on Mississauga and Anishinaabe territory. I'm part of a mixed rural-urban riding that has been looking forward to a transportation option that connects the rural parts of our community to the urban parts, and we're seeing some innovative options working already. This has been a difficult year for all Canadians, It's highlighted the importance of our connections, whether it's connections to our communities, to our loved ones, our internet connections, our ability to get around the community and to see our loved ones, to get to work. These transportation options are limited in rural communities, in remote and really small and really remote communities, as my parliamentary secretary, Goody Hutchings, reminds me. And for years, rural communities have been advocating for evening the playing field. And as Catherine said, we are doing just that. Today is a celebration for the advocacy of all those who've come before us coming into fruition, particularly to rural caucus and rural community leaders like those on this call. You asked for a rural lens to be applied to our government decisions. We created a rural lens, and that has helped us with our response to COVID, particularly. You asked for a separate stream for rural and northern infrastructure projects that recognizes the lower density and the unique needs of rural communities. We listened. You asked us to bring back rural data. We did that. You asked us to bring back a minister responsible for rural economic development so that there's a greater voice around the cabinet table. I'm the second rural economic development minister. You asked for a flexible and generous broadband envelope. And with Catherine's help at the Infrastructure Bank, our government has now put forward the single largest investment in broadband in Canada's history. And we are approving applications that have come forward every single day. You also asked us to see active transportation in your communities as an option. And Catherine's announced the first active transportation fund of its kind. And today we recognize and celebrate the importance of rural transit in communities that are remote, small, and need help creating transportation solutions that are locally tailored and will improve the health and safety of their residents and lead to greater economic development. I'd like to particularly thank the women's advocates, including Indigenous families who've been asking for greater solutions on transportations. You told us that your families and your youth and your women are particularly vulnerable without transportation options that are accessible to them. You told us that youth are more likely to leave rural communities without the options to stay connected. And you told us that you don't want to see your communities hollowed out and that active and public transportation needs to be part of Build Back Better. Our government's listened. This fund is going to provide those communities with smart ideas, with solutions that are ready to go, with the predictable funds over the next 5 years to do just that. I'd like to also recognize that municipal leaders, particularly, have had a lot on their plates over the past year. We thank you for your service. We recognize that you've had a lot on your plates. We recognize too that there is no one size fits all. So we look forward to working with you to improve connections in rural communities and watch you thrive. Back to you, Catherine.
Well, thank you very much. Are we going to hear
From Kelly Taylor's next.
Okay, Kelly, we can't wait to hear from you and what you think about this announcement. And I should say, Kelly Taylor, once again, is from Rural Rides, New Brunswick.
Thank you, Minister Monsef and Minister McKenna, for giving me the opportunity to join you today in this very exciting day and to share about how we in New Brunswick are providing solutions to rural transportation issues. The lack of transportation in rural areas compounds the effects of aging and poverty by limiting access to medical and essential life needs. The problem is complex because of the vast area to be served and the reality that rarely are two or more people traveling to the same location at the same time. Door-to-door volunteer driving programs like Rural Rides are an affordable way to fill the need for transportation in rural areas, offering people a ride where and when they need it. Rural Rides is one of several volunteer driving programs operating in New Brunswick, and we work in partnership with Teledrive Albert County and the Volunteer Center of Southeast New Brunswick to provide service throughout the southeast area of New Brunswick to both urban and rural clients. Our clients are generally seniors, people living with disabilities, newcomers, and low-income families. So someone needing transportation can register for free for the service and then call and schedule transportation 48 hours in advance. Our ride coordinator then will match that need with a volunteer driver who picks up the client at their home at the designated time, takes them to their appointment, waits for them, and brings them back home when they're finished. Our clients are invoiced a small fee at the end of the month for each ride. The office handles all the payments and the scheduling, so the drivers, as a volunteer, are really just tasked with driving. All of our drivers go through a very stringent screening process, including criminal record checks and social development checks, to make sure that it's a safe service for everybody involved. This style of transportation allows for flexibility, particularly as we've seen during this pandemic, making it easy to pivot back and forth between taking the client to the needs or the needs to the client, depending on the severity of the lockdown at any given time. In addition to meeting the basic life needs by providing essential transportation service, rural volunteer driving programs have allowed seniors to stay in their homes longer, helped isolated individuals and families connect with the community around them, facilitated new friendships, and for many of our volunteers, most of whom are retired, helped them overcome feelings of isolation and disconnection, particularly during the pandemic. For some of our clients, their trip to the doctor is the only time they leave their home for weeks on end. So it's particularly important to have that personal connection with the person taking them there. And it often means more to them to have that conversation with another human being than it does to actually access the medical care in the first place. Rural Rides is a program that subsidizes fees for our users to make sure that it's affordable for those who need it the most. So we do depend heavily on grants and donations from all levels of government, business, and private donations. So this announcement today is very exciting for us, and we're very much looking forward to how that's going to help us have a greater impact in our community and the communities beyond.
Much, Kelly. I think it's really important to hear directly from folks who live in rural areas who have unique solutions so that you can really personalize it. And you can imagine that the riders who, as you say, don't have other options to get to their medical appointments also really appreciate having someone that they can chat to. It might be one of their, limited connections in a week. So now we're going to go to Jana Burns. She is going to tell us about her experience. Jana is from RideWell in Wellington, Ontario.
Thank you, Minister McKenna, and thank you, Minister Monsef. I want to first of all commend the Government of Canada for providing this opportunity. It sounds like it's going to really allow for flexibility and creative solutions happening across rural communities across the country. And speaking from Wellington County, where we've been implementing our own creative solution to rural transit in the past year and a half, it's only been of great benefit to see what we can do. RideWell, what we have is a rural transit service based on ride sharing, so an online booking and monitoring system that provides rides all across Wellington County and into and out of the city of Guelph. For the past year and a half, we've provided over 3,500 rides, and given that we're in a pandemic and we're not currently able to provide actual ride sharing, you can see that there certainly is still demand. And as my colleague in New Brunswick, Kelly, had mentioned, people that are trying to get to appointments, young people that are trying to volunteer back in our communities, or people trying to get to a job. It's wonderful that we have subways and high-speed trains that get us to the cities, but working in economic development, and Minister Monsef can agree that we have businesses that are saying, even in our rural communities, we have the exact same needs. We need to get for goods and services, just as we do with people. We need to get access within our rural communities. So our challenge was that we cover a very large territory. We're over 2,600 square kilometers north and south of the 401, but we have very low population densities, about 85 people per square kilometer. So the other problem was that we have limited municipal dollars, as everyone can appreciate. So we were looking at a bus service, and that didn't really make sense for us. We've now partnered with a bus service that works in another community that provides greater connection across other rural communities. But it really has enabled us to have a greater economic impact. I can only imagine what further funding would do. We have 4 cars on the road right now, providing up to 25 rides per day. And that is obviously low right now given the pandemic, but we're looking at more things that we can do, even expanding into delivery services, because we've seen that as a need. So we in rural are used to having to come up with creative cost solutions, and I'm just so excited to see this funding, and so excited that our solution, which is also an environmentally friendly solution, because ride sharing, less cars on the road, we want to get more creative. We want to work with other rural municipalities to enhance what we're doing here as well. So I thank you.
Echoing what I hear from lots of folks, small town mayors, that there are limited dollars. And so how do we stretch those dollars, but also how do we get more cars off the road? So this is great. It also is great for attracting people to those smaller communities. And I think there's a lot of interest, but you need to make sure that you have good transportation options. I think that's it. I'm going to hand it over back to Chantal.
Thank you, Minister McKenna. We'll now start the question period. Nous allons maintenant commencer la période des questions. As usual, one question, one follow-up. Comme d'habitude, une question et une question suivie. Operator, could we have the first question on the phone, please?
Please press star 1 at this time if you have a question. S'il vous plaît, appuyez sur étoile 1 maintenant pour poser une question. There are no questions registered at this time. I would like to turn you back to meeting at this time.
Thank you. This concludes the press conference. Ceci termine la conférence de presse. Merci et une bonne journée.